Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Jacint Jordana. I'm introduced to be the moderator of this session. This is the first plenary session of the conference, International Conference on Public Policy held here in Barcelona. And it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Ken Weber, Professor of Public Policy and Government at the Georgetown University, who is going to talk the lecture called "What Do Politicians Want and What Does It Mean for Public Policy?" Professor Ken Weber is Professor of Public Policy and Government at Georgetown University and a Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution. Before joining the Georgetown faculty, he was full-time Senior Fellow at Brookings Institution in Washington. Weber's research focused on how political institutions, feedbacks from past policy choices, and strategic behavior of politicians interact to shape public policy choices. He is particularly interested in understanding when and why politicians undertake actions that appear to offer more political risk than rewards. His recent research focuses on comparative welfare state politics, behavior change, and on the determinants of compliance and non-compliance with public policy across a variety of policy sectors. He has published extensively in different areas of public policy, including social policies, federalism, public policy design, among many others, including also the role of think tanks in public policy. In addition to his teaching at the McCourt School in Georgetown University, Weber works with the Stanford University Leadership Academy for Development on capacity building in developing and transitional economies through case-based training programs for government and NGO officials, and programs to train faculty of public policy schools in case writing and case teaching. So it's our pleasure, and we thank you very much for coming here to Barcelona, Professor Weber.
I have to remember to take off my mask. Many thanks to IPPA for asking me to give this talk, and especially to Grace and Philippe and the executive committee of IPPA. It's really a great honor for me, and also an opportunity to share some general thoughts on research that's been done in public policy in a comparative and international context, and also research that I think needs to be done in the future. As Jacint said, in my own work, I've tried to bridge the gap between the study of political institutions, very broadly conceived, and the micro foundations in terms of individual and group behavior. And in my talk today, I want to continue in that vein, looking at one of the most basic micro foundational questions, which is, what do politicians want? That is to say, what are their objectives? And what are the objectives that they actually act on, and to argue that the answer to that question can be found to a large part in institutional arrangements. And I want to ground these insights in even broader questions that have become of increasing concern to me and increasing interest as I move further away from being able to credibly claim to be a younger scholar and think about these broad sorts of issues, very broad issues, big questions. How do we make sense of a world of almost infinite causal complexity and variation in ways that are useful in terms of presenting our research to other researchers, to citizens, and even to policymakers? And how can we analyze phenomenon like politicians' objectives that we can't directly and reliably observe? And the broad argument I want to make is that we already have analytical tools and a lot of research that can be used to address these questions. We just need to integrate theory and evidence more effectively. And on the slides, I'm going to give some examples of research and theory that I think is relevant to the various arguments that I'm making at the bottom of the slide, but I won't always refer to the authors and the particular research just for lack of time. So a quick roadmap. We're going to start off with a very basic question. What do I mean by strategic politicians? What does the political science literature suggest about their objectives? What's the methodological problem that I want to focus on of not being able to observe directly? In terms of theory, I'm going to argue that most politicians have multiple objectives. They have to make trade-offs among these objectives. There are specific conditions that allow us to predict with a fairly high degree of reliability which objectives politicians will prioritize. It doesn't matter what objectives they may have, it matters which ones they prioritize. Also to argue that which objectives they prioritize makes sense, matters a lot in terms of policy processes, choices, outputs and outcomes. I'm going to say a little bit about how you research the unobservable and then give a little bit of evidence. So let's start with the most basic question and the prelude. Who counts as a strategic politician? What do I mean by a strategic politician? Well, the boundaries aren't very clear, but I think you can say that individuals who hold or seek either public or party office, and especially those who want to influence public policy, and also who, in most cases, depend on selection by others to retain office through a reasonably transparent process. That's sort of a narrower definition. I'm going to also talk about autocratic regimes where it is certainly much less transparent, and also officials who lack lifetime appointment and employment security. So this approach may be less useful for understanding the behavior of people like civil servants and judges who have lifetime appointments, non-political officials in technocratic governments, and of course dictators and their henchmen, or hench people. But I think much of the logic works for them as well, but the weights that they're likely to give to different objectives is going to vary. So what do I mean by politicians' objectives? So a lot of the rational choice literature is framed in terms of preferences. That is what politicians want in the relatively short term. I'm going to argue that objectives are preferences that for individual politicians influence choices over with a pretty high degree of consistency and stability over multiple choice situations over time, and are also things that are shared not just by one politician, but by multiple politicians. Some politicians, for example, may have the objective of maximizing their consumption of chocolate donuts, which is something that I can certainly sympathize with, but it doesn't, presumably not something that influences the behavior of lots of politicians in consistent ways. So why do we care about politicians' objectives? The political science literature suggests that politicians have a major impact on political and policy outcomes, the sort of things that we care about, that they have their objectives, influence their strategic choices, their behavior. That, of course, is mediated by political institutions, but ultimately it affects policy choices, outputs, and outcomes. So, for example, staying in office objectives are often seen to contribute by people like Jonathan Boston and my collaborator Alan Jacobs in a presentist bias, the unwillingness of politicians in many countries to govern for the long term, to address issues like climate change in a serious way because they think it imposes short-term losses for which they will be punished by voters, even if they agree that it's a long-term objective that needs to be addressed. Personal gain and career advancement objectives, I'm going to be talking about later with respect to China, and there's a substantial literature that suggests that these two sets of objectives contribute to rampant corruption and also to manipulation of the cadre evaluation system, the target-based responsibility system in China, despite the fact that if you get caught, the penalties can be quite severe. So what does the political science literature suggest about objectives and behavior of strategic politicians? Well, I think it's not unfair to say, as the article that I cite down there suggests, that the literature suggests a preference for selfish preferences, not unlike this cartoon that I show here, where Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz is saying, Auntie M warned me about characters like you leading me astray, no courage, no brain, and no heart. Oh my, you must be politicians. So that's the popular culture notion, but I think also reflected in a lot of political science. And a sort of simplistic rational choice or strategic politicians' argument is that politicians seek to maximize their utility in their strategic decisions. But what does that mean? It's not very useful because we don't know what gives them utility. So more specific answers have been given, and the most common answer reflected in particular in the people from the tradition of David Mayhew, saying that elected politicians in particular are office seekers. He says, I will conjure up a vision of US congressmen as single-minded seekers of re-election and then see what the implications of that behavior are. And he argues that this very simple model explains a lot of what members of American Congress do. But there are several variations on this view of election-minded, staying in office politicians. Anthony Downs, for example, says that political actors are vote maximizers. William Riker, on the other hand, says that politicians want to maximize their chances of being elected, but they also want to form minimum winning coalitions because they don't want to have to share the spoils of office with a larger number of people than is needed. And some political scientists have argued that politicians seek the positions of median voters and they slavishly follow changes in public mood. So again, from the American literature, Stimson et al. Have argued that politicians are like antelopes on an open field. When they perceive public opinion change, they adapt their behavior to please their constituency. This, of course, has been questioned. Other people have said, for example, that at least politicians tend to be responsive to changes in public opinion, but they may not shift the whole way. And I think that other literature recognizes that the public, that issue salience matters. So Anthony Downs, with his famous issue attention cycle, argues that politicians, when an issue is a very low salience, may not pay attention to what public opinion is, and public opinion may not be very well formulated. But when there's this jump, the discovery and enthusiasm for addressing an issue, then they may be responsive, and that may tail off as public interest declines. And in fact, the politicians may try to stall on action until they think that public, the salience of an issue has declined. So this is a cartoon down here of the National Rifle Association in the United States. And the idea there is that they are trying to get to stall Congress after every mass shooting incident, not to act when the issue salience is high, and realize that they can then control policymaking. So this notion of politicians being office seekers is certainly dominant in the literature, but it's not the only one that's in the literature. So Shepsley, for example, has argued that politicians may maximize different things, that elected politicians are interested in maximizing their votes. Legislators, who also, of course, are elected politicians, want to maximize the amount of goods that they can bring back home. Bureaucrats are interested in maximizing their budgets or turf. So these are the sort of simplistic notions that we see in the political science literature. But I think there also is a substantial literature that recognizes that politicians can have and do have multiple objectives. So for example, Muller and Strom in their work on European parliaments argue that in coalition formation, European party leaders have three different objectives and they have to make trade-offs among them. Good policy preferences, the policies they want to enact if they can get into office. They also want to be in office because of the perks of office and influence over powerful departments. And they are also interested in vote seeking, both in the short term and long term. And there can be trade-offs among those. Their argument is that that politicians tend to be short-term oriented. So they're going to focus in particular on winning office, even if they think that they have to compromise on policy or that it may require them to do some things that are unpopular that will lose them votes in the longer term. So the literature on the US congressional committees argues that those politicians, members of congressional committees, try to seek various mixes of three different kinds of objectives: ideology, that is to say, policy consistent with their own ideological preferences; reputation and influence within the chamber; and then, of course, also re-election. And that people tend to sort out among the committees depending on what they're interested in. If you're on a committee that deals with very ideologically divisive issues, that you may want to be on that committee if you have an emphasis, if you tend to prioritize ideological variables. On the other hand, literature on the courts, and in particular, I'm going to point here to the work of Diana Kapachevsky on the Brazilian Supreme Federal Tribunal, their Supreme Court, argues that judges there tend to trade off among 6 different objectives with different balances among cases. In other words, in some cases, an ideological objective may be prioritized by the justices. In other cases, they're more concerned with sort of practical economic repercussions. They don't want to decide a case, even if the law suggests that they should, in a way that is likely to hurt the Brazilian economy. So what's the methodological problem that we have here? That studying politicians' objectives is difficult because they can't be observed directly. They are difficult to untangle, and oftentimes it's difficult to predict, well, is this consistent with both an office-seeking objective and an ideological objective, for example? They may not understand even themselves why they're prioritizing. They may vary over time in how they're prioritized, something that I'm going to focus on. And also, if you could, of course, just ask politicians, why did you make this decision? But people tend to lie about things where say, oh, I just did it for re-election. They will say something like, this is what my constituents want, or this is what I deeply believe, or this is the position of the party. So because we can't observe objectives directly, we have to impute them from behavior, choices, outputs, and outcomes. So I would argue that the result is that research on politicians' objectives is generally over-assumed. And what I mean by that is that authors will say, well, I'm going to assume that politicians are electorally motivated, or I'm going to assume a good policy objective, and oversimplified, that is to say, that they tend to focus on one objective rather than a potential combination of objectives. It tends to be under-researched, and then I think the findings tend to be poorly integrated and aggregated across different studies. So, oops, I think back one. Okay, so I'm going to try to address ways to think about the unobservable and make a series of arguments about the sources and the impact of politicians' objectives, with the objective of developing a framework that's fairly generalizable across countries, across regime types, reasonably parsimonious, but also customizable to look at particular situations, and conditional and contextual. That is to say, that incorporates factors that influence which kind of objective a politician is likely to prioritize. And I'm going to use the term arguments to mean causal assertions that are, at least in theory, testable, but are fairly general, more general than the usual hypotheses that we test, that probably need to be narrowed in order to be able to test them very usefully. So first argument is politicians may have one or more of several objectives, and these objectives include the 6 that listed here, but are not limited to those things. So why did I choose those 6 objectives? Well, I use the method that I call the Inspector Renault from the film Casablanca method, round up the usual suspects. I looked at the literature and said, well, what sorts of objectives seem to appear in the literature as objectives that politicians want? And I think that that's an underestimated methodology for what you choose. So each of these has different behavioral perspectives and expectations and sort of different policy implications. So for example, winning and staying in office, both in the short term and the long term, leads to the behavioral expectation that politicians are going to adjust policy positions to those favored by those who have the ability to put them in or keep them out of office, which can be voters, political superiors, campaign donors, the military, et cetera. Good policy preferences can be derived from several different sources, partisan affiliation, broader value system, professional training, things like that. And I'm going to talk later about how these can be either what I would call endogenous or exogenous. Endogenous coming mostly from within yourself, or endogenous that are imposed in some way from the outside, for example, by party discipline or by the Chinese cadre evaluation system. A third objective is career advancement, not just wanting to stay where you are, but to advance in your career, move to a higher office. And again, the behavioral expectation there is that you will adjust your policy to fit with the preferences of those who have power over your future career. I'm only going to talk about 4 of the 6 objectives, but certainly another objective that can be important is personal gain. And this can either be legal or illegal. This is a nice cartoon here from the India Today news magazine, and it just shows the legal perks that a cabinet minister has in India, which are quite considerable in terms of salary, benefits, staff, et cetera. But of course, personal gain can also involve illegal rent seeking. And the behavioral expectation there is that you're going to change your behavior in ways that will be favored by those who have the power to reward you personally. Okay, so again, I'm talking here about 4 different objectives: staying in office, good policy, career advancement, personal gain. But of course, there are others as well. Michael Laver talks about prestige, power, reputation, and glory. So I show a politician there for whom I think those may have been important objectives, but politicians may also want to have the objective of preserving the system, the sort of rules of the game, something that may not be prioritized heavily because it's not called into question. It's not a salient issue, but certainly important for many politicians. Preserving the power and reputation of specific institutions, for example, courts in systems where the power of the courts is still pretty shaky. They may also just want to articulate and express policy views, even if they're unlikely to be adopted in the short term. So a third argument is that the intrinsic, sort of internal objectives of politicians are less important than the objectives that get triggered and prioritized in particular situations. In other words, you may have all these different sets of objectives, think all of them are important, but which ones are you likely to prioritize if you have to make some trade-offs among them? And so which objectives get prioritized and why? So 4th argument is that politicians' prioritization of objectives and their strategic choices is constrained by 4 different types of things: sort of macro level, political opportunity and threat structure, political vehicle, situational factors, and individual characteristics. Show quickly on this slide, over on the left, these are the kinds of independent variables, with the intermediate variables being politicians' prioritized objectives, and then policy and political choices and outcomes being the dependent variables. So just to give you a very quick sense of each of these, the macro level political opportunity structure includes things like, term limits. Obviously, you're not going to try to stay in office if the term limits say that you can't, unless you're in a system where you have a lot of control over the rules of the game and can change them if you're the president of the system. Electoral rules, federal versus unitary structures, et cetera, all can influence the kinds of prioritization, and I'll give some specific examples of this. For example, if you face term limits, you're more likely as a politician to prioritize career advancement objectives. If you have weak accountability mechanisms, you may be more likely to engage in rent seeking. Ward Barenshot has done some really interesting work in India and Indonesia about state social service delivery capacity. If the state can't serve everybody and therefore they need brokers in order to get services, then politicians have an opportunity and are likely to prioritize rent seeking. But of course, political vehicles also matter to win political office. So what are some potential hypotheses about the importance of the role of political vehicles? That is to say, the organization within which you build your career as a politician. Well, if you're in a closed list proportional representation system, then you're more likely to respond to the good policy preferences of party leaders. If you're in a system with party primaries, then you may be more responsive to the good policy preferences of the voters who are likely to vote in that primary. So situational factors also can matter over time. Again, the intensity and distribution of opinion on issues, election and selection cycles. Politicians may be, and there's some literature that suggests, some that doesn't, that politicians may be more responsive to citizen preferences as an election approaches. Skipped over one. So some examples of situational factors, giving increased priority to election selection criteria and objectives as in election years. And politicians and small protest parties may be driven more by good policy preferences when they think, and expressing those when they think they're not going to win elections, but as there are opportunities for winning elections increase, they may change to be more electorally focused. So Wendy Hunter has done some nice work on this in Brazil. Lastly, similarly situated politicians may also vary depending on their individual attributes and their point in the political career. If you're about to retire, you may care more about your historical legacy than if you're not seeking re-election, how secure they are in office. If you're very secure, then you're maybe more likely to give attention to your good policy preferences. So the fifth argument is, these different situational factors lead politicians to prioritize particular objectives. And I'm not going to go through all of this. I'm just trying to provide some examples here of what are some of the things these either the institutional factors, the political vehicle factors, the situational factors that are likely to lead politicians to prioritize good policy objectives. Well, just start off with one, that if you are a member of a political party that has clear and broadly shared ideology that provides clear signals on good policy, that you're more likely to emphasize good policy objectives. I'm not going to go through the whole list here for reasons of time. In terms of staying in office, if there are credible threats of losing office, then you're more likely to prioritize that objectives, particularly if the perceived costs of losing office are high. So if you're a cruel dictator who is likely to be executed or at a minimum exiled, you're more likely to emphasize staying in office objectives. In terms of career advancement, then you're more likely to emphasize that under a number of conditions, including that if that higher office offers you opportunities to pursue other kinds of objectives or higher returns on those objectives. Okay, so then the accompanying paper gives a longer list and some literature references to all of these things. I'm just trying to give you a sense of how the independent variables may affect which objectives politicians prioritize. So sixth argument is that politicians would, of course, love to maximize all of their objectives all of the time, but they can't. They're often forced to make trade-offs between and within those objectives. So I'll just give one example here, which is the conflict in European Green parties between what are called the Rialos and the Fundis, where on the one hand, the Fundis want to adhere to strong environmental position, those that are favored by the party base. So that's sort of the expression objective. Others say, well, gee, if we're going to win office, we need to develop a broader repertoire of issues that voters see us as being expert on. And so we need to develop those new issues. So that's the more electoral orientation. And then also they're sometimes faced with the need to compromise if they want to enter into a coalition agreement with other parties to win power. Of course, this is a situation that the German Greens faced in the late 1990s and are almost certain to face again after September 21, because you can't achieve any of your objectives if you don't hold office. Okay, so a seventh argument, and here I'm going to go back to some rational choice modified by the insights of cognitive and behavioral economics to suggest that in making these kinds of trade-offs, that politicians tend to act with bounded rationality. They of course have imperfect information, face high uncertainty. They may think about decreasing marginal returns to individual objectives. So for example, if I'm already winning 70% of the vote in a first past the post system, then I can give a little in terms of my vote maximization and focus more on good policy objectives. They tend to have a presentist or at least short-term bias. They tend to be risk and loss averse. That is to say, they discount losses versus gains. That in general, they're likely to give high priority to career goals, all else equal, but not always prioritize it all the time because it's a prerequisite to achieving their other objectives. But again, I've cited some examples, some clear examples in the literature where that's not the case and why that's not the case. And then of course, context matters, that individual politicians prioritize different objectives in different situations, depending on things like how salient the issue is, how proximate an election is. The eighth argument, though, is that politicians try to act strategically to limit the conflict among objectives so that they don't face these very clear, severe sorts of trade-offs. And you can see it in agenda setting. So for example, if there's an issue that politicians in a particular party think will allow them to achieve 2 or more objectives, then they're likely to press that onto the agenda. Or if they think that it can make their political opponents worse off in at least one objective, they're likely to press it onto the agenda. But they try to keep off the agenda issues that they think will make them worse off on one or more policy dimensions. And we'll come back to this when I talk about pension reform in a few minutes. In terms of venue shopping, again, a similar sort of calculation takes place, that politicians try to move issues into venues where they think that they can make gains on multiple objectives, or at least be Pareto optimal across objectives. That is to say, be better off in at least one objective and no worse off in others. And the same sort of thing you can see in issue framing, that they try to frame their own position in ways that lessens conflict between objectives and tries to heighten conflict for their political opponents. That is to say, that allows you to say, my opponents are hypocrites. They say that they believe in this good policy, but in fact, they're acting in a way that's inconsistent with that. So, you know, a couple of examples here. Politicians, the literature, there's a nice literature from people like Larry Jacobs and Bob Shapiro saying that politicians don't pander. They use crafted talk. They try to frame issues in a way so that voters won't see a conflict between, or that they won't face a conflict between taking a position that they believe in and losing votes. So a good example would be President Clinton's healthcare policy proposal. You don't try to change politicians or the constituents' basic values just to change the way that they perceive the issue so that they won't punish you for taking a principled position. Of course, the risk of that is, since politicians are dealing with imperfect information, is that they may overestimate their capacity to move public opinion and underestimate the capacity of their opponents to frame the issue in a different way that highlights the conflict that they face. Okay, so that's sort of the general way that I think about the multiple objectives of politicians, how they are formed, and a little bit about the policy consequences. So let me say a little bit about how you can try to marshal evidence for the objectives of politicians and their strategic behavior. So there are more direct forms, and then there are least direct forms of evidence you can draw. So contemporaneous statements and interviews. If it's something in the past, things like diaries and biographies, ethnographic studies. Analysis of roll call votes, not very helpful in most parliamentary systems, surveys, expert surveys, process tracing, and then least direct in terms of evidence of politicians' objectives is quantitative analysis of policy outputs and policy outcomes. But I'm going to argue that it can still be important, and I'll get to that in just a minute. How do you address the methodological problem that you can't observe objectives directly, that it may be, oops, I think sorry, I forgot I added these slides. A couple of examples of evidence that I'll give that I have found particularly useful. So Ward Barenschot, for example, in his research on India, followed a local level politician around and just looked at how he spent his time, this particular politician, an Ahmedabad municipal councillor, and found out that he spent about 90% of his time in activities that can be considered re-election oriented and personal gain oriented, that is to say, meeting illicitly with people who might offer him bribes, and very little on policy. Well, you know, that's some evidence about prioritization of objectives that I think is quite useful. Another very different type of evidence from policy outcomes that goes to the factor of how situational factors may affect which objectives politicians prioritize. There's a nice study of deforestation in Brazil that found that deforestation rates increase 8 to 10% during election years in municipalities where there's an incumbent mayor who's running for re-election, and that this effect is particularly strong where the mayors are corrupt, and they have measures of corruption, and have to self-finance their own campaigns. Therefore, you know, are dependent on donors in order to get re-elected. Okay, so again, lots of evidence, none of it perfect. What it suggests, I think, is if you want to study politicians' objectives, you need to use multiple objectives. You need to look at multiple steps in the causal chain, and preferably look at multiple sectors, look at multiple time periods, look at how situational objectives vary. You know, when theory suggests that you would expect some variation. So I'm not calling on this as an individual mandate that everybody should do all of these things, but we should think about this as a discipline of how can we aggregate studies to more effectively look at politicians' objectives. Okay, so let me just give a little bit of evidence and more detail on on how politicians prioritize their objectives. I'm going to give just 2 examples here, but I think that they show some interesting factors. The first is on if lots of politicians have similar prioritization of objectives, then we would expect those to be reflected in aggregate behavior and aggregate policy outputs and outcomes in that political system. So if you have lots of corrupt politicians, then you would expect them to rank really low in the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. I'm going to focus on, there's just a fabulous literature from a generation of younger China scholars, and younger, of course, means anybody younger than me, but considerably younger than me in this case, on how Chinese prefectural and provincial level officials try to prioritize different objectives. So the sort of independent variables things are over here on the left-hand side, the prioritized objectives are in the middle, and then the policy consequences are on the right. And these are sort of theoretical expectations from what we know about the system. So we know that China has an integrated party state career ladder, that there's a target-based responsibility system, which sets quantitative targets, or in some cases, it's just nominal targets that they have to meet. But it's imperfectly monitored, getting the data can be manipulated, and it's hard to get a lot of the data, and that they face very frequent career rotation. And there are also opportunities for local protectionism and corrupt relations between local businesses and provincial and prefectural officials. So what sorts of objectives does this suggest would get prioritized? Well, certainly you can't ignore the centrally imposed policy objectives that are focused on growth, increasingly on the environment, but still growth is central. That they're also going to prioritize career advancement given this frequent rotation of office, and that there are at least opportunities for personal gain. Not that all politicians will follow them, but that some will. So in terms of policy consequences, you'd expect rapid growth, some cheating in the target-based responsibility system to meet the targets, and some pretty widespread corruption. So I'm going to emphasize, I'm just going to introduce you for those who may not be familiar to the research of 4 scholars, which I think really stands out. One is actually my Georgetown colleague, Ning Ling, and she writes on local development in China and what she calls visible development first. The idea there is that politicians prioritize their career advancement, that it isn't enough just to qualify to meet all of the criteria to get a good post, that you need to do things to stand out because there are so many officials competing. And so these local officials tend to implement visible development projects that will win them awards that will be helpful in their next promotion. So the policy consequence of that is you're likely to get projects that are short-term in their emphasis because you need to do it before the next promotion cycle comes up, and are often pretty ineffective in promoting the sustainability objectives. A second piece of work that I find really interesting is from Denise Vanderkamp, who currently at City University of Hong Kong, about to move to Oxford, on what she calls blunt force regulation. The idea there is that because the central government actually has fairly weak capacity to monitor enforcement, especially of environmental issues at the local level, that weakens compliance with good policy environmental objectives, and the only way that they can make sure that those objectives, the central government can make sure those objectives are met is through very blunt techniques like shut down all the industries in a municipality, even if they are meeting the environmental criteria. And she argues that environmental enforcement is poorly targeted and therefore weakens economic development. A third piece of interesting research using super high-tech stuff that I think is really cool. Victoria Shen talks about what she called the political pollution cycle, that prefectural officials in China tend to emphasize economic growth, essential to their career over pollution objectives, and that they are particularly likely to do this as they are coming up for reappointment, and their performance is likely to be scrutinized. Well, how can you measure this reliably as an external observer, since we know that officials lie in their official reports about economic growth. But there is now satellite data, very localized, that allows us to see luminosity, how much light there is, which is a pretty good indicator of economic development, and also how much pollution there is at the local level. And she has been able to link this to the career cycles of local officials and say that this strategic behavior, this shirking, tends to increase as officials approach reappointment, especially if they're younger and tend to serve in regions where there's less weight given to environmental criteria. So again, the policy outcome is a political pollution cycle. So last piece of research that I'll mention very briefly is that China's target-based responsibility system, again, forces local officials to at least try to meet criteria that are set locally, but it also leads to what she calls strategic pernicious manipulation of target data that therefore requires the central government to invest a lot of money in monitoring. So the overall pattern, I think, is consistent with this idea that politicians have multiple objectives, and which objectives they tend to prioritize are heavily influenced by the institutional structure, by the political vehicle. In this case, it's the integrated party state in which they operate. So this target-based responsibility system leads to a mix of externally imposed policy objectives and career advancement objectives. Oops, sorry, we should be on to the next slide. But also personal gain, something I haven't talked about here, but there's a large literature on it. And which objectives are prioritized depends on the opportunity and threat structure. So a second example that I'll give briefly is from my own research with Karen Anderson on pension reform in 7 wealthy democracies. And so our empirical question is, what explains differences in pension reform processes in choices in, I'm just going to talk here about US, Sweden, and Germany. Again, the broader study has 7 countries in it. Okay, so just briefly summarize the outcomes. The US has basically done nothing since 1983, 38 years without any major reform to Social Security, our basic pension system. Sweden enacted a big bang reform between 1992 and 2000 and has basically stayed consistently with that, with some incremental reforms. Germany's had a sort of more middle pattern of some pretty frequent incremental reforms, but also a couple of big structural reforms. So we think that looking at politicians' objectives and from a game theoretic perspective can be really helpful in understanding the choices that different governments make. So you can think of politicians as having 3 sorts of incentives: a political incentives, a fiscal responsibility incentive, and a pension policy incentive. And here I'm going to highlight, we're talking about the differences between in a system where there are governments who have to make decisions about whether to initiate policy, in other words, to put it on the agenda, and opposition parties who may want to, for example, increase the financial sustainability of a pension system, but may find it really hard to resist the temptation to blame a government for imposing losses if it cuts back on its pension system. And for reasons of time, I'll skip this slide, but we talk about first movers and whether first movers in fact move or not to initiate the agenda, whether they try to win the support of opposition parties or just try to roll over them. And our argument is that, which objectives they prioritize, in particular the electoral objective or policy objectives, depends on several factors having to do with political institutions and partisan polarization. I won't go into the argument here because I want to make sure that we finish in the next couple of minutes, but actually go forward 1. I will just mention the United States here. We can come back to Germany and Sweden in time. So go forward. So I'll just mention the US case, which is an intriguing case because it has been a complete failure of policy response. And I think that this cartoon here kind of summarizes the reason for that. Again, think of the trade-off between the incentives of opposition parties, which are to blame the government if they can, but on the other hand, they may want to solve the problem, right? So if you think that it's a highly salient issue, then you are more likely to go for the political incentive of blame generating. So it doesn't matter which party is in power, Republicans or the elephant symbol, Democrats or the donkey symbol, but in both cases, they got an axe hidden behind their back. And if the party that's in power tries to initiate pension reform, they're likely to try to cut their heads off. Okay, but again, skip through the next couple of slides because for reasons of time, but the German and Swedish situations where there's less partisan polarization make that less likely to occur. And the overall conclusion that we have is that given the high salience of pension policy, successful reforms likely to require formal or informal mechanisms that mute these incentives for blame generating. Okay, so as Groucho Marx once said, those are my principles, and if you don't like them, well, I have others. Well, these are my examples, and if you don't like them, I have others as well that I'm happy to share with you, but I don't want to take the whole time. So let's go to our concluding thoughts on strategic politicians very quickly. Okay, so overall, I think that understanding this interaction between politicians' objectives and their multiple objectives and the institutional and political vehicle and situational factors, can help provide a better micro foundation for understanding policy choices, outputs, and outcomes, and that it is possible to make progress in thinking seriously about politicians' objectives, even though they are unobservable, but that multiple methods are needed. Individual factors are still important. Friedrich Engels famously wrote to Borgias, saying that even if there hadn't been Napoleon, the exact Corsican that history would have demanded that someone who fulfilled his role would have been there. The idea of substitute Napoleons in one variant of Marxist theory. Yeah, I don't buy that. I think that individual characteristics really do matter, and it can be for better or for worse. So, Marx once said, talked about Napoleon and Louis Napoleon being history repeating itself. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. I think by the time you get to Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro, we're beyond farce to grotesque. But anyway, individual level factors are still important. So what are some implications for future research and for policy? Almost done. So first, going back to my big theme of in a world of almost infinite complexity, we need to avoid oversimplified assumptions about politicians' objectives. We need to focus on under what conditions are particular objectives likely to be prioritized. We need to think about broadening our skill set. The examples I gave of the scholars who work on China all work with multiple methods, and I think have made it's made their work much better. And if you don't have all the methods, work in teams that have those different skill sets. Third conclusion is that you need to ask the right research question. And I think too often there's been a tendency to say, let's find out what's really important for politicians by choosing a really stark choice that they face. And what do they do when they're faced into this really stark choice? Well, I would compare this to, since remember, politicians try to maneuver to avoid being in that situation. That would be like doing looking at a linear regression and eliminating all of the data points except for the ones that are near the regression line, and just saying, what can we tell from looking only at the outliers? Because those situations usually are outliers. I think more helpful research questions are, how do politicians maneuver to avoid stark trade-offs, and how do their opponents try to compel those trade-offs? So fourth thing is use the right building blocks. And again, I think the building blocks to understand a lot of what happens in public policy involve thinking about politicians' prioritized objectives and their strategic choices, and as a complement rather than a substitute for existing there. And very last point, that in designing institutions and policies, we need to think about what's the impact likely to be in terms of which, in later iterations, as policies being implemented and policy is possibly being reformed later on, which objectives they're likely to prioritize. Because again, which objectives politicians actively prioritize can make a big difference in policy. So I'll stop there. Thanks for being very patient, and I look forward to a lively discussion, I hope.
Thank you very much for this inspiring speech and to making us to understand better the complexities of politicians' behavior. I think has many topics and many issues has been discussed, and there are of course many possible questions. We are going open for a first round of questions here in the auditorium, and in parallel we'll collect questions by the people connected online, and if you those that are connected online, please write questions in the chat, and we will collect and transmit them to to Professor Weber. So let's start now with questions here in the auditorium, please. We'll collect 3 or 4 and then allow for answers. Please go ahead. The macro is coming.
Oh. Thank you. Wonderful tour de force and review. So I know that you're focusing on politicians, but of course the politicians are interacting with some key alternative actors, and you mentioned at the beginning. So I'm just wondering about 2 types of actors that are increasingly obviously important in the policy process, and how you see their logics and their incentive structures engaging and interacting with politicians. So one is a kind of yes minister scenario, the politicians interacting with bureaucrats. So that's one. The other one that, of course, has been heightened in terms of its importance during the COVID period is the interaction between politicians and experts, and particularly medical experts, which is a different class of bureaucrat with a different legitimacy base. And so, the kind of motivations and preferences and objectives that you've outlined get entangled with a whole other set of logics when it's coming from experts. So those are the 2 kind of actors. I'd be just interested to get your thoughts on how they interact with them.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thanks a lot, Les. I think if you, I said near the outset that I think that same framework applies. You might also want to include some additional factors. I mentioned the fact of particular institutions and wanting to preserve the role of particular institutions. So I think it's probably likely to vary in terms of higher level officials, whether they circulate among ministries or whether they tend to build their careers in a single ministry. If they build their career across ministries, then they're more likely to think of career advancement and where I'm going to go next, and probably making them a little bit more deferential, this is my hypothesis, to the preferences of politicians. Whereas if you build your career within a ministry, then not the Downs budget maximizing bureaucrat, but maximizing the influence, the reputation of the agency is likely to be more important. So I have resisted so far talking about COVID, but I can't once you get to talking about the role of policy experts, and I will here turn to the example of the United States and make a little bit of a comparison with Germany, that in the United States, you see this very delicate balance between, for people like Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx, who, clearly were not comfortable with where the president was going, but also were aware that if they wanted to preserve any influence and not get fired, they could not oppose him too directly. So I think that experts, and in particular Fauci, emphasized good policy. And I would say he also made good mistakes because this is an area where there's a huge amount of uncertainty at the beginning. So he said at the beginning, in the United States, don't wear masks. And that was because he wanted to preserve masks for medical personnel, first responders who he thought should be given priority. But, that message could have been, I think, done better so that it was seen less as a reversal. But in general, experts, my general hypothesis would be, are going to be, if they're outside of government, focused very highly on good policy preferences, and if they're within government, need to be concerned with maintaining office in order to maintain policy influence. Does that help? Okay.
Thank you. There was another question over there, please.
Thank you, Professor Weber. I have two questions. What do you think about the role of the social media in the understand of the decision making and politics? And how do you think the citizens can use this information from social media to take a correct electoral decision?
Okay. Well, again, the COVID experience, and not just in the United States, which I know best, but in other countries as well. In Germany, for example, social media has been a big source of misinformation. And the problem is that with essentially uncontrolled and very much manipulated dissemination of information through social media, this misinformation can make it harder for politicians to take stands that involve imposing losses. So for example, mask mandates or social distancing mandates, or vaccination requirements, or even urging people to get vaccinated. If you have groups that are trying to use social media to achieve their own, I hesitate to call good policy objectives. In some cases, I think they're trying to undermine confidence in government objectives, or undermine confidence in a governing party as their objective. So I wish I could say that I thought social media could be a force for getting politicians to focus more on good policy objectives. And I would be delighted if you could give me evidence that that's true, but I don't see the evidence, at least from recent experience with COVID. Now, clearly, there are other situations where that has not been the case. So the Arab Spring revolts, for example, where social media played a big role, led to the ultimate form of accountability for some governments. That is to say, they were overthrown.
Thank you. There's another question. I see one here, please. Oh, well, that doesn't matter. Yeah, that was.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ken. I have two questions. First is, Did you find significant differences in objectives between right-wing and left-wing politicians, or even between different backgrounds like activist-based or entrepreneurs or bureaucratic politicians? Do they make different decisions when they confront these trade-off situations? Thank you.
Okay, that is a really interesting question, and I don't have the data on that. I'm providing the framework. I'm hoping that other people will go out and answer some of these more specific questions about whether right-wing and left-wing politicians are more likely to be corrupt. There probably are studies on that, but I don't know. I mean, the system that I know best on this is Brazil, and the answer is both of them can be pretty corrupt, but that the politicians with more localistic bases and often right-wing orientations have tended to be more corrupt. But it's an empirical question to which I do not have an answer. But I hope others will develop it. Great research agenda.
Thanks, Kent. That was really excellent. I have a question about the personal preferences and the micro-individual factors that you, as you call them. You certainly developed very well the institutional and the more situational factors that can influence the priority among the four objectives that you spend time discussing. But I'm having a little bit of I've got a question around whether those individual factors relate to the micro-individual factors relate to the relative priority that's put on the four objectives that you focused on, or whether by virtue of the people that whose faces you showed us, whether there's things like rationality or irrationality, or sort of more sort of a state of psychological well-being or not of individuals. So I think that, you know, it's a great framework you've got. I just am asking for a little bit more explanation of what falls into that micro-individual factor category.
Right. So I didn't spend much time on it because it is so diverse that, you know, I could have spent the whole time talking about that, and it's not an area in which I am an expert. But you know, I think that individual psychological characteristics, for example, personal experiences that can influence, you know, whether you prioritize an issue because of something having to do with your family experience or some those sorts of things. All those, I think, can influence your choices. That is it rational or is it irrational? I'd say there's some of each. That the simplifying assumption I make is that politicians act with bounded rationality, but there are clearly people like Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro who act with unbounded irrationality. You know, incorporating those sorts of outliers, I think, in any general kind of model just makes the model too big to be very useful. You have to examine them as exceptions. Yep.
Okay, there was another question here.
Thank you so much. In some polities, de facto elites or politicians are not those that hold the euro power. I thought of asking you for your thoughts on how your arguments and your framework travels to situations in which these two aspects of power, de facto de jure, are a little bit delimited, such as, for example, in more authoritarian regimes where elites use their proxies in formal institutions. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. So I think it's really hard to generalize about less well institutionalized authoritarian regimes. I talked about China, which is a very highly institutionalized authoritarian regime. Vietnam, another highly institutionalized authoritarian regime. But I think that what I would say in general is that authoritarian regimes are incredibly diverse, but given the downsides of power loss, that you may not just face a loss of your position, you may face a loss of your freedom or a loss of your life, that the implication of that is that you do the priority that you give is likely to be to maintaining your political office and then maybe some career advancement. Again, most of the time, what that is likely to lead to, and I think the evidence supports this, is a unwillingness to make decisions. Even in China, you see this, where officials are reluctant to innovate in areas where they think they might meet with disapproval because the downsides are very high. And even providing information which isn't what the leaders want to hear can have negative career and life consequences, shall we say. So if the leadership has very strong policy priorities that they make clear, as has been the case in China, then the lower down officials, whether they be de jure or de facto, and this, of course, is an important complication, that oftentimes the de facto leaders, as you say, may be members of the family, members of a military junta, informal advisors. But overall, I would say the priority is likely to be given to those maintaining your career prospects, or some advancement, but probably more maintaining your position. And if it is tolerated, as it is in some systems, the potential for personal gain, if you think that monitoring is not likely to be high. So, but again, generalizing across authoritarian regimes is really hard because they're so diverse. It's like, was it Dostoevsky who said, every happy family is the same, every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, every authoritarian system is dysfunctional in its own way.
Thank you. Now I'm going to transmit 3 questions from our
Sure.
online delegates. The first one is about what they say, who do you call politicians? No, they are. Do you understand politicians as professional ones, or also those who construct political careers from bottom-up level?
So my definition is politicians who seek or hold political office or party office. So civil society advocates, I would not include within my definition of politicians. I think that, again, a lot of it carries over, right? That most people have multiple objectives, that, civil society advocacy organization may face the same sort of dilemma that experts do. For example, if you are too strongly opposed to the government, then you may be cut out as a stakeholder from participation in any consultation activities, especially things like formal commissions. So you have to consider, future influence rather than future office, and maybe having to compromise on your policy objectives to do that. So, as with bureaucrats and judges, I think the framework applies less well to those groups, but there are, a fair number of things that carry over.
Thank you. Another question from Marcos Lopez. It's about the case, for example, of Trump in the US or Bolsonaro in Brazil. No, he says, they are examples of politicians who are not afraid of taking bad policy objective and values. Politicians will be ashamed to stand up for it because they figure out it resonates with a certain part of the society. What are the implications of this phenomena for your framework, in the sense of this policy objective?
Of bad policy objectives, you said? Yeah. Okay. So, well, bad policy objectives is in the eyes of the observer, but I would frame it in terms of politicians who are willing to undertake positions that are, at least in some segments of the population, very unpopular. And so I'm actually working with Marcus Hinderleitner and Matthew Flinders now on an idea that Marcus came up with, which is the blame-seeking politician. You know, I've written before about blame-avoiding politicians, but there are politicians who are blame seekers. Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro are not afraid to take positions outside the mainstream, are not afraid to offend both with their personal behavior and with their norm violation and their policy positions. These are not people who are necessarily aiming at the median voter. And so why does that occur? Well, you know, what we're working on is there are a variety of factors that contribute to it. You know, high degree of political polarization. If you think that you can win the support of some voters by bashing other voters, if you think that those other voters are less likely to be participating, or if you think that you can exclude them somehow from participation, it can increase your incentives to do that. So the implications, I think, of policies that are unpopular are, you know, it depends on the policy. If there are policies that are maybe, you know, outside the mainstream, but not exclusionary, then I am, well, it depends on the policy, but I'm less worried about it. But policies that you see many of these governments undertaking, and I will use my own country as an example, the efforts of Republicans to undertake exclusionary policies that will keep minority voters from participating, undermines faith in democracy, undermines the democratic system, and Bolsonaro's behavior is equally bad in terms of flouting the law, engaging in massive corruption, and firing ministers, unstable government. I mean, all the things that you usually think are bad, yeah, they're bad.
Thank you. So to conclude this first round of online questions, there is another one asking about the impact of social media. And the question is very, very simple. No? So what do you think about the role of social media on political actors' objectives and preferences and their priority decisions, their priorities?
Okay, so I'll begin by saying it's not a subject to which I've given a lot of thought, but you know, I think that because it has no filters and is often distributed in ways within communities that leads to self-reinforcing opinions and the failure to consider other opinions or more objective opinions, that the effect that it has on politicians is likely to vary depending a lot on the politician, but it empowers some politicians who are willing to undertake to take up positions that are, I would say, irresponsible.
Thank you. So let's go back to the auditorium for more questions. I remember there was a question that, I don't know. Yeah, please, she was waiting for a while.
Thank you. Professor Weaver, you mentioned in a couple of your responses the role of COVID, and it's hard right now for any of us to be thinking about conditions outside of COVID, but I'm curious when you talk about under what conditions and making behavioral observations and drawing conclusions about multiple objectives, what some of your preliminary thoughts are about how we make sense of crisis conditions from a methodological standpoint.
Right. In terms of thinking about the general framework, it's something that increases issue salience and therefore makes it more likely that politicians will pay attention and be more electorally in tune to prioritize electoral considerations in terms of their responses. But we've just seen wildly different responses across countries. With Germany, for example, I think undertaking pretty responsible choices and a real contrast between American federalism and German federalism. And in German federalism, one state, one land takes an initiative and often the other Länder follow along in that, even if they're things that may be fairly controversial, whereas in the United States, in a much more polarized political system, the Republican-led states have often taken very libertarian positions, and democratic states have taken very different positions. So, I think it's hard to generalize about crisis because you have to say, what's the nature of the crisis? Is it a crisis that polarizes? Is it a crisis that doesn't polarize? And it may polarize in one system and not polarize in another system. And again, the effects may vary depending on what degree of centralization, how easy it is to overcome joint decision traps, to use Fritz Sharp's terms. So.
There was another question. Please.
Yeah, thank you for your great speech. Actually, my question is a little bit provocative, and it's the role of coincidence or maybe an accident as a structuration of the political objectives. Because, well, when we try to explain like the political outputs, for example, I'm from the Czech Republic, and we tried to explain the outputs of some kind of like the outputs from the educational policy. We try to we don't have any understandable gain why these outputs were chosen by the particular politicians, as they support them, stand for them, and so on. So maybe this independent value or something like that. Yeah.
So a final point I was going to make, but I cut out for time, is no framework can explain everything, and that your target should be if you can explain half of the variance some of the time, then that's probably pretty good. So I agree that a coincidence and accident, you seem to be going beyond even what people like Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson talk about, which is conjunctural factors that come together and then for reasons that aren't very clearly explicable, it sets you down a path, and you continue to go down that path, and it's easier to explain what happens once you're on that path and how you got on that path in the first place. But coincidence and accident continue to play a role in the kinds of prioritizing that politicians make in some situations. I would say some cases, an issue comes on the agenda, politicians really have no sort of framework. They don't know what the electoral consequences are likely to be. They don't know what the what good policy is, because it may be a new kind of policy situation, so that they have no sense of, is this likely to affect my career advancement perspectives? There's no personal gain. And in those situations, yeah, I'm not sure what to predict in those things, but I would suspect that they're likely to act on the basis of analogy. I really don't know what to do. I don't know what the best choice is. I don't know what the electoral consequences are going to be. But we tried this in policy X, policy sector X, and in education policy, well, maybe we could do something similar and maybe it would work. And I can at least explain to voters that the sort of logic of that, and I can explain to my fellow partisans the logic of that. So I would expect analogy to be a basis for policymaking in those kinds of situations, but that's a rough guess. Yep.
Thank you. There is another question here, please.
What do you notice that are the principal changes in US policy that about what do politicians want that highlights the last 20 years of polarizations that froze the changes in some areas of politics that, for example, migration?
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So, I think that it's a variety of things that, again, tend to shape policy generally, but often through the channel of politicians' objectives. And so some big changes I would highlight are, again, high polarization, which started at the mass level. It started at the elite level and then worked its way down to the mass level. Increasing distrust in the system, I think, also plays an important role. And the fact that most of the time, about 80% of the time, we have what's called divided government. So the party that controls the presidency doesn't control both chambers of Congress. And when you think about what that does for agenda setting in terms of politicians' incentives, it means, Social Security pension policy is a good example, but there are others as well. There are, if you think that anything you do which is close to what your party wants will be opposed by the other party, and given that it's a system with multiple veto points, you're not going to get any policy payoffs in game theoretic terms. You're going to propose something and it's going to fail, and you may be electorally punished for it. So I think that is a reason why the United States has been unable to address our pension reform, our immigration policy, climate change policy, and why it often doesn't even get on the serious decision agenda of government, because it is so polarized and so prone to deadlock. So that in a system of very close electoral competition that suggests we prioritize our electoral objectives, we downplay good policy objectives. I would also say that that's different at the state level, because the pattern that's occurred at the state level is there's been an increased sorting. So increasingly we have at the state level what's called trifecta government. That is to say, both chambers of the legislature and the governor are controlled by the same party. And so there you see much greater divergence in policy, because you get divergent preferences being represented by governing majorities and governors in the state legislatures. So they can get policy payoffs, and they think it's consistent with their electoral payoffs of playing to their political base. Yeah.
Well, I have two questions. So the first question is, well, in China, in the Chinese context,
who would be the politicians that you call as the strategic politicians? So who are the strategic politicians in China, according to you? And the second question is that I think that in the, because you mentioned multiple objectives for the strategic politicians, like the election or the career promotion. So for instance, in the Chinese context, I suppose there is no such pressure over the politicians, right? So do you think that the pursuit of the legitimacy could be the driving dynamic for the politicians to kind of to push forward the policies like the big data, the blockchain, the artificial intelligence, things like that? Thank you.
Okay, sure. So I think the strategic politicians framework can be applied to politicians at all levels in China. I think I was talking about provincial and prefectural officials, but you can apply it to the top leadership as well, and to the Politburo, to the Central Committee, and of course there's no pressure for election, but there also is periodic selections through a very opaque process for higher level party bodies and for higher level executive positions within the party state. And so I think the same sorts of considerations apply that I talked about for local level officials apply at upper levels as well, with some difference in the weighting that, central party good policy priorities matter, career advancement matters, not losing your position matters. And I think you pointed out something that I skipped that I think is really important, which is that the pursuit of legitimacy and behind legitimacy, social stability and political stability and party control are central objectives to the top leadership, which then get filtered down to lower levels as well. So one piece of great work that I didn't get to mention by Isa Ding is about what she calls performative governance, the fact that local level officials often can't produce the outcomes that the local level electorate, the local citizenry wants. So they go through the motions of doing things that look like they are being responsive to dampen any sort of citizen protest or opposition that might get the attention of higher up officials and damage their career. So I think that's all part of this process of trying to increase legitimacy, not as the end result, but as the means to social stability and party control.
Well, let's go now for a few other questions from our online participants. I will read you some of them. Well, Marie-Louise Maguillon asked if in your view, what will make politicians' chief priority to good policy goals in context dominated by corruption and vote catching?
Right. So what was the second? So corruption and
vote catching.
Vote catching?
Yeah.
Okay. Better monitoring, better enforcement are, I think, absolutely key to reducing corruption in any environment. That's much easier said than done. China is a good example. It's what, ranked 70th now or something like that in the Transparency International Corruption Index. It's down around India, despite the fact that they have a pretty well-developed monitoring system. So, and enforcement is at least as important as monitoring. If you get caught and you don't get punished, then it is less likely to have an impact. But I think that stronger parties make a difference as well. Parties that have strong platforms and both the politicians share particular policy objectives and are willing to act on them. Certainly makes a difference as well. But boy, there sure are no magic bullets in highly corrupt systems.
Thank you. Another question by Filipa Figueira asks you, how does the framework you propose fits with the agenda for behavioral governance, which yourself and other colleagues proposed in a recent article published in Journal of European Public Policy?
Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar with, Anat Goffin and Alice Mosley and Ava Toman and I just did an issue of Journal of European Public Policy that talked about behavioral governance. So I think our focus was mostly on how do issues get on the agenda, and then what sorts of policies are likely to be most effective in terms of improving the quality of governance. In terms of agenda setting, one of the things that we talk about is the difficulty of getting issues on the agenda that don't address the concerns of a politically powerful constituency. But I think that the implications are more on the design of policy side, and that you need to have well-informed, expert, influenced policymaker, to go back to Les's point that that drives good policy-driven objectives in policymakers, but listening to the best policy advice.
There is there is another question. I cannot transmit all the questions because many questions have arrived, but there is another question. It's about unaccountable political systems where politicians run roughshod over policy making and implementation. And the question is, what hope is there for other actors, such communities and civil society, to influence the course of public policy?
I think that they can influence public policy by holding politicians electorally accountable and having them say, we need to have policies that are sensible, that are well-designed, and that voters will respond to that and punish us if we don't. That's sort of on the accountability side, but on the influencing policy formulation side, I think that civil society organizations need to engage with government, both formally and informally, to transmit both the views of their members, and if they have policy information that is useful, then transmitting that as well, assuming that politicians will pay attention to views on what good policy is when it at least doesn't seriously harm their interests. Civil society organizations can play a major role there.
Thank you. So let's move now again to the auditorium, and there is a question. This was interesting. Please, can you pass the micro at the end?
Thank you, Ken. I was wondering, we have a pretty good idea now of the first part of your question, or the answer to the first part, what do politicians want? But could you like summarize the answer to the second question?
What does it matter for
really
public
mean
policy?
for public policy? Because I mean, is it so decisive what politicians want for public policy, or isn't public policy determined by many other actors who are just not politicians? So I was just wondering whether you could like give us the answer for the second part of the question.
Yeah, because it's such a simple question and there's such a simple answer that's a one sentence answer that's available. So I didn't even talk about, sort of the right-hand side of that middle box was that politicians have these preferences, they make strategic choices, and then it gets channeled through political institutions that aggregate those various strategic choices that politicians make and turn them into policy. So I didn't even have a chance to talk about that, but there's a lot of literature about that. I'm going to dodge that question and say there is no simple answer but that, what I tried to suggest is there are lots of smaller answers that you can aggregate to get, to some pretty important conclusions that, for example, if you, to take what Meyer got, the Chinese system was the fact that politicians prioritize this set of consequences based on this set of objectives really does have some important policy consequences that are unique to the Chinese system, but explainable within a broader framework. But the shortest possible answer is when politicians prioritize personal gain, you get very inefficient government, and you get policy outcomes in terms of economic growth and distribution and everything else that are terrible. We sort of knew that already, so that's the extreme case. But China is kind of a medium case where you do get rapid growth, but you also get some inefficiencies and you get substantial levels of corruption. So I think that China can help us understand those cases which are not completely corrupt systems, and understanding objectives, I would argue, can also help you to explain in interaction with institutions whether you get political systems that are responsive to changing policy challenges or not responsive. So again, the United States and Europe on climate change is a good example of that. It's not just the fact that there is a tendency towards intellectual gridlock in the United States, and there is polarization. Clearly those are key, but also key is the fact that electoral objectives, and in particular blame generating perspective incentives, are very strong in that kind of system, and trying to solve policy problems is not very strong. So I can't say, well, things are going to fall into these three different categories of outcomes, but I can say, given this set of institutional and political vehicle consequences or facts, it's likely to lead to, in policy area X, prioritization of these objectives, and policy area sector Y, prioritization of different objectives, that on a sector-specific basis can be very helpful in understanding, and then you can aggregate it across those sectors to make broader statements about the impact on public policy.
Thank you.
Thank you for a great presentation. I want to reiterate on a point Les made and make a suggestion to increase the observability of these trade-offs you are studying, and spend more attention to political advisors or personal advisors. So not just any advisors, but the advisors you would typically find in executive advisory and support offices. Mm-hmm. And since these advisors are on the rise everywhere, the numbers are growing, there might be a lot of ex-advisors around to interview. And these are people who are the closest aides of executive politicians. They also lay out the consequences of certain decisions in terms of what it means for election negotiation costs and what have you. Also, they are the ones who often summarize the priorities of ministers to other actors like the administration. Also, my suggestion would be to give them a bit more attention in this field of research. There is, of course, the caveat that the loyalty they had in their time in office as advisor extends in their afterlife too, and they may want to protect the reputation of the politicians. But still, I'd like to ask attention in the research for those people.
Yeah, no, I agree that that's important. So people like Stefan Svalfors have developed a whole literature on the role of these more political advisors, and I think that that's important. They're usually not the ultimate decision makers; they're the advisors. So it's a little bit more difficult to trace their impact on decisions, but I agree it's something that that should be considered. There are many research agendas that I'm suggesting here.
There is another question from online participants. It's about the complexity of policy objectives. It is something that you refer, no? And it's about the case of Brazil, no? And he says, the name is Fernando Filgueiras, the goals in relation to vaccination are totally different from the goals of economic policy in Brazil. While President Bolsonaro is a denial of the vaccine, part of the political elite supports him through targeted economic reforms. How does this complexity and differences of policy objectives result in a government legitimacy and support?
Sorry, could you repeat the last part?
Yeah, the question is, how does this complexity and differences of policy objectives result in government legitimacy and support?
Okay, so that's a broad question. I think that it is often the case, as the questioner suggested, that you get parties that support an executive, particularly in coalitional presidential systems like Brazil, because they have particular objectives that they want to achieve, and see a politician who they may disagree with on many issues as the best vehicle to achieve those sort of specific objectives. And that may give the politician more leeway to impose their own good policy or bad policy preferences on the public, again, assuming that they can build a coalition in this case in the Brazilian Congress to pass those policies. So the question is whether is it necessarily a problem that you have diverse coalitions? And of course, that's a problem in governance generally, and in coalitional presidential systems. I think the personal case of Bolsonaro is sort of an extreme version of that, where there were a lot of people who voted for him because they didn't like the other side and were voting to get them out. You know, in a system, in a two-round presidential system, you can end up in a situation where you get an official like Bolsonaro that I think really does undercut the legitimacy of the system.
Yeah, all right. So we are reaching 4, and well, we have to conclude for the session. Thank you very much, Professor Weber, for your lecture, and also for all your patience answering so many questions from the public, also our online delegates. So thank you very much again.
Sure.